はい、こちらに入れちゃう。入ってる。はい。おはようございます。私が増川なんですが。
Good morning, and I am Masukawa. But in our industry, I think I'm famous, but this Mr. Maskawa doesn't speak English. So as a scientist, I think I'm a rare type. So excuse me for using Japanese for this lecture. And we have translators here to translate from Japanese to English. Yes, and this is simultaneous interpretation, so I think everything is moving on smoothly. And can I introduce you? First of all, I believe everybody here knows who you are. I don't think anybody needs any introduction.
Day of the third HOPE meeting. We'd like to start the first session. It's a great honor to introduce to you Dr. Toshihide Maskawa, Director General of Kobayashi Maskawa Institute for the Origin of Particles and the Universe, Nagoya University, and Nobel Prize Laureate in Physics in 2008. The title of the lecture is How Science Stimulates Young Minds. お願いいたします。
はい、
Well, thank you, and I have to start by apologizing, I suppose. Maskawa speaks only in Japanese. As a scientist, he may be a failure. And also, there was a accident that happened before this. I had wanted to send along the storyline that I would be talking along to the interpreters, and I wrote down the script. However, I created the script on my Mac computer, and the Mac computer that I have isn't good at speaking Japanese, it seems. I saved the document and I tried to put it up on my computer once again, and I found that everything was jumbled up and garbled, and I had to come over here on Friday, or rather leave my university on Friday. So I had to complete and send the draft by Friday. However, my Mac computer went haywire, and you find these jumbled up words on the screen, and I was so flustered with that. And I asked one of my students to somehow recreate the draft that I've written. However, it wasn't totally recreated. It still had some unreadable words within the draft. And I'm going to read that, or I'll be using that draft with these garbled words. And I never am so flustered like today, but I am really nervous today for whatever reason. And I will be thinking along the way as I speak. So please excuse me for that. But what I want to say today is about how young people can start out in the world of science. The people gathered here today, I assume, are already researchers. So maybe you don't need to hear this. But I believe that if you are at a start line of a fresh, new research, and if you hear me speak, it might tell you how to approach science. And if you are a researcher, I believe you will rethink about how to approach science. Because in 10 years' time, you will be a researcher and an instructor of younger students. And people, as they grow old, they forget how they've developed because they are already established as a researcher, and they forget what they've done and what they've come through in the past. So please, I want you to remember what you have gone through before becoming established researchers, because that will help you when you start instructing students and younger researchers. So that's the focus of my talk today. Well, young people will be exposed to many things in their daily lives, and sometimes they will see some scientific happenings that they can't even imagine. And they will see scientists trying to tackle these issues. And the young people will probably admire these scientists and want to know more. And like Don Quixote, they may, in the place of helmets, wear wash basins and ride a donkey for a travel. And they travel and venture on. I believe that young scientists are like Don Quixote. And as they meet and see many things, they would learn about the science that is right in front of them. They learn as they go. So in that sense, when young people approach science, they start with this sense of romance or sense of admiration, aspiration toward science that they imagine. And I hope that the society will give the young generation this aspiration and admiration towards science. And in many cases, this is not taught by teachers or their superiors. This is something that the young generation need to speak and discuss among themselves. They need to speak to the same generation people to discuss so that they can have this admiration and longing toward knowing about science. Now, what is the task of science? When I think about this, I cannot help but think about what is freedom. Hegel once said that freedom is the insight into necessity. This comes from one of his books. I think it is in the middle of his famous book. But Hegel used very ununderstandable expressions to express what he wants to say. Sometimes I think he was a wicked person. It takes about 2 weeks to read 2 pages of his books, because one interpretation may lead to a different interpretation in another sentence. So it takes weeks to really understand even 1 page. But in any case, if I may try to interpret his words here, I'd like to take this example. Let's say that there are 2 buttons right here, and you don't know which button to press, but you know that pressing one button will present you with 1 million yen, and you can get that 1 million yen. The other button will release cyanide gas, and you will die. Now, you are free to choose either button. If you are told that, do you think that you are free to choose? Yes, you are told that you are free to choose either one, but there is no freedom here. You are just giving yourself up to probability. So Hegel is saying that freedom is about knowing what will happen based on your choices that you make. And then if you have the freedom to choose, then it means that freedom is the insight into necessity. That is what he's saying with these words. So then let's go back to science. What is it that scientists do in the task of science? I believe it is preparing freedom to humankind, a freedom to use the result of the scientific research. So science is going to prepare this framework of freedom to humankind. That is what I think. So then, if we think so, if science is preparing this freedom to humankind, are all sciences the same? Now, this reminds me that there are different roles that science can play. And I want to say that basic science is really important. And when I say this, my colleagues would tease me. Maskawa, you are involved in particle elements or elementary particles. That's why you say basic science is important. So just listen to me as I speak. What do I mean by this? Jean-Henri Fabre is the person who wrote the entomological souvenirs. I think it's a very voluminous book, but about 60% of that book, or somewhere in between this book, there is an episode that takes about 10 pages of this volume, and it is about what happened in Avignon, where he lived. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, but this is me. I'm sorry. I hope you allow me. The mulberry leaves became sick, and the silkworms that feed on the mulberry leaves also became sick. And this was a big incident in Avignon because silk was an export item of France back in those days. These silk textiles, women probably wore these silk dresses back then. And so the silk industry was a very important industry back in France those days. And this industry was damaged greatly because of this disease spreading among the silkworms. And France was trying to tackle this issue. And the head of this task force was Louis Pasteur. And his task force group was sent to Avignon to tackle this issue. Now, Fabre, he thought that he knew everything there is to know about insects. He was the person with the best knowledge on insects, and if he can cure the silkworms, and if Pasteur was coming to say that he will solve this problem, and I believe Pasteur, you all know, is very famous for creating the rabies vaccine, and also he established bacteriology, and he also solved the problem of how diseases would spread. He understood that mechanism, and this Pasteur was the head of this group. Now, Fabre thought that if Pasteur was coming to solve this problem that he couldn't solve, maybe Pasteur knows more about silkworms than him. So Fabre was really interested in what Pasteur was about to do. And now Pasteur came to Avignon, and the first thing he said was, "I want to see a silkworm." And that's what he told the village mayor. And Fabre thought, oh, he's going to diagnose the silkworms. And so Faber went along with Pasteur. But what did Pasteur do? He took up a silkworm and looked at it. Do you know what a chrysalis is? Or have you ever seen a silkworm? You have these baskets of sorts where you have a lot of mulberry leaves and you have the silkworms on top of them so that they can create a lot of silk. So Pasteur went to one of these silkworm farms, and Pasteur took up one of the chrysalises and he looked at it like this. So Faber thought, oh, he's about to give a diagnosis to the disease. But what did Pasteur do? He took it up and shook it right beside his ear. And he said, oh, it makes a sound. Well, Pasteur never saw a silkworm or a chrysalis until then. And Faber was really surprised at this. But in the technology back then, it was not a pathogen, but there was something that couldn't be found with the technology back then, in the microscopes that were used back then. But Pasteur knew how diseases could spread, so what he did was he ordered that all the sick silkworms and the chrysalises should be burnt and disposed. And in about 3 months, he went back to where he came from. And there is something here that tells us about the real essence of science. On the one hand, you have Faber, who knows everything there is to know about insects, an entomologist. And on the other hand, you have the bacteriologist, Pasteur, or a biologist, who knows about the basics of biology. He may not know about silkworms, but he knew about the mechanism of diseases and how it spreads. And so here you see this example that tells us about the importance of basic science, and that basic science can be applied very widely. I think this episode tells us this lesson. And everybody says that because I am involved in elementary particles, that's why I say this. But so you can discount what you hear from me, but please understand that half of what I say is true. Well, I said that basic science is good and basic science is important, but this basic science, of course, something has to happen before basic science really becomes useful to humankind. And now I come to talk about Maxwell, who established the study of magneto-electric fields. Now, if there is electric charge, you know that there is an electric field around it. And if you have an electric current, you have a magnetic field around this. This is the law of Ampere. And after this law was established, that was at the beginning of the 19th century, but these learnings and laws were compiled, but the issue here was that the displacement current wasn't identified and discovered yet. However, Maxwell identified this, and he added this to Ampere's law and announced this in 1864. And that's nowadays known as Maxwell's equations. And the solution of these equations tells us that the wave travels through these electric or magnetic fields. And you can use these equations by Maxwell, and you can understand that the wave that travels was actually measured by Fizeau and Foucault 10 years before Maxwell announced this equation. And even before that, Saturn has its own moons or planets, and these things were utilized. Of course, that's not it, but if you are interested, you might want to think about how you can measure the speed of light. But already the speed of light was detected and it was measured by Fizeau and Foucault. They measured it on the ground. Fizeau went to the rural area where it was very dark, and he used a fast rotating gear. And he found that there was these mountains and troughs, and how the waves traveled. It was 8-point-something kilometers, and there was a reflection, and the reflection went through the measurement. And so the gear rotation, if you adjust it, you will understand the time it takes for the light to travel back and forth. And before that, Foucault was more divisive, and he came up with a way to measure the speed of light in a laboratory. So if you are interested, you might want to look them up. But in any case, the speed of traveling wave was exactly the same as the speed of light. So Maxwell understood that light is an electromagnetic wave. But understanding that doesn't mean that you can really use the Maxwell equations. Hertz, within his laboratory, used asphalt, and I'm not really sure where he got that, but he piled asphalt up to 2 meters, and he made his prism, and he understood that how radio waves would be reflected. But in any case, still the equations weren't used really effectively. It was only 80 years later, after the release of these announcements, that the equations were really used, and it was nearing the war time. And of course, during the war, airplanes were used. You wanted to detect enemy airplanes as quickly as possible, and here people tried to use radio waves. The short wavelength radio waves had to be created, but back then the vacuum tubes, which were really expensive back then, of course you don't want to place these radar wave emitters outside in the rain. And you have to have these equipments up on the roof because the radio waves have to travel a long length. However, the radio waves themselves are created indoors. Now, what is the problem here? Well, take a wire. And of course, these radio waves are like light, so it is emitted out into the space. You have to keep it within the wire, meaning that you have these wave guides, a little box to keep the radio waves inside this, and you have to let the waves travel inside. And is that it? No. From indoors up to the rooftop, you have to send the waves up. And if the wave guides are bended, the waves are reflected back. It doesn't travel through. So how do you really effectively let the waves travel through the waveguide? You need to look at the shape the geometric shape of the waveguide. You have to match it so that the wave will travel through the waveguide. And if you say matching, you might imagine something else, but you have to match the shape. And that was when the Maxwell equations really became useful. So it took 80 years since Maxwell came up with the solution. So as science advanced and you start knowing these basic general rules, but before they become useful to the society, it usually takes about a century. And I tell the story to anybody I can. And what about thermodynamics? And what about others? It usually takes about 100 years before they become really useful. And it's 100 years after the equations are established. It takes about 100 years until it becomes useful to the society. But recently I have found that there are other paths. There are bypasses, should I say. For example, NASA in the United States, they launch rockets. They send the man to the moon. And the biggest issue here was about what to do with the heat. The rockets nowadays are very large. So you have room to put the human being and room between the human being and the wall, the exterior wall. But in the past, the wall that faces the sun would be about 300 degrees Celsius, while the other side, on the dark side, would be about 100 degrees minus. And if it spins at about 80 RPM then the temperature of the exterior wall will be averaged. However, you can't spin a person inside the rocket.
So it is necessary to very efficiently try to turn this side, which is facing the sun, to the other side. And here came the heat pipe. It was a very simple mechanism. But I think there was someone very smart who came up with this idea. So he produced this copper tube and put pneumonia and sealed it. And they put in copper mesh along the wall. And by doing so, the side which is exposed to the sun, the ammonia immediately becomes gas, and the pressure is lowered so that it's close to vacuum state. And then because it's gas, it goes this way. And this side is cold, and this side is cold, and therefore it's cooled down, it becomes liquid. And then once it's become liquid, then it goes back through the mesh because of the capillary effect. So it's a very simple mechanism. But when I read this, it's some decades ago that I read this, but I thought that compared to copper, and this is about, the heat transmission is about 200 folds more efficient. And yes, it's true. And NASA developed this. And the Japanese audio manufacturer, that company which loves transistor, they produced this audio, and they wanted to form it into a transistor. It's good for signal processing, but the large electric power, the power transistor, it becomes very hot. And because of that, you have to do something about this heat. If not, the transistor will burn down. And so it's a very sensitive, delicate device. And this is my experience. But in around 1980, I bought this PC which looked like a toy, and the capacity is very low. And to boost it up, I bought an IC to increase the memory. And well, I bought this IC. It was a package, and I opened the lid. And what it said there was this IC wrapped in a foil, and there was also a manual, an explanation there. And when I read this manual, what it said was that take off your socks. And once you take off your socks, go to the sink in your house and stand there. So I'm not a big guy, but a small guy, but I was an adult. I took off my socks and stood at the sink. It really is funny to imagine what I look like, but what this means is that you know this, but there is a static electricity running through the human body, and when you open the package, it could be that this static electricity would charge to the IC, and this would destroy the IC. So that is how sensitive the transistors are. And the power transistor, well, it generates heat, and therefore there is a need to release this heat. So, well, if it's a normal signal processing, there's no problem, but it's an audio device. It's about 100 watts. So there is electric weight of 100 watts being charged. It's not this small, but it's really powerful. And you need to do the heat treatment. And for this, they use the heat pipe. And this was 3 years after NASA used it, this mechanism. So as you can see, it's not science per se, but science, because it's become so advanced, to research science, the various equipment you use for experimenting have to also be devised with different ideas. And well, this is a human skill of these devices, and so the technology that is developed there is something that can be applied in our daily lives. Science per se, it takes about a century for it to be applied to technology, but bypass, it's quick, like this. Quick. When I tell these stories, I do have these scripts with me, but I always digress. And I think I've only covered about 10% of what I've written down here. And I always tend to end in the middle of my script. But what I want to say is, well, I'm getting the message through, don't worry. Well, in order for young people to succeed in science, you have to become like Don Quixote. In the beginning, you have this admiration, and you research, and then, well, you say Einstein is a genius, and you get interested and gradually come close. And once you get close, then the young people are tempted to do something. And when they're tempted to do something, well, there is a lack of knowledge and experience, and from an adult's point of view, it's like Don Quixote. They're doing something like Don Quixote. Well, it's what the reality of science is different from what they had imagined it to be like. Yet, the young people have to start somewhere. And like Don Quixote, well, they start something weird, go out to travel, go on a voyage. And through this experience, well, Don Quixote, for example, he grew up. It didn't say this in the book, but the young people would grow up. And so it's important to make the first step, have this admiration, and sniff around you. And there's something that will tempt you to start something, and start. It's important that you start, and then Of course, you'll face a number of obstacles, walls, but gradually, step by step, you will come to see the truth of science. So don't just wait and see, because nothing will be achieved through just waiting. What's important is, well, I think it's important that you continue to debate with your colleagues of the same generation throughout the night. Well, I asked my mentor questions, but he always came up with very brilliant questions. That was the answer. That's the end. But when I talk with young people, they come up with different ideas, say this and that. No, it's this and that. And the topics would go from here to there. But in this process, you can acquire something new. And this is most important, that you are surprised that your friends know about something. And well, you might try to make it appear to be as if you know everything, but when you go home, you go to the bookshelf and try to look up something that you've just heard. And so it's like that. It's important that you debate with young people of your generation, and you discover a lot of things there. So please have friends who you can debate throughout the whole night. And when I say these things, it always becomes a problem. But, well, can you do that with a girlfriend? Well, yes. These days, I think it's acceptable that you have such peers. I think society has come to accept such things in our generation. Well, there was this gender difference. You were not supposed to sit with women at such a late hour, and it was indecent to do so. Well, that was the story until our generation, but I think you don't have to worry about the gender these days, and you can just be very candid and talk with whichever of the gender that person belongs to. So what I want to say here is that you should have this admiration, and like Don Quixote, go on a voyage, go out, and through this process, you grow up. And another important thing is that, well, modern science, well, this is the message I really want to communicate to you, but what is the current situation of science today? Well, in 1901, the first Nobel Prize in physics went to Röntgen. And this is a very important discovery in the field of health, public health, but X-rays. Well, this is something. This is the result of this very active movement, a very short wavelength at the at atomic level, and I think we can say this, but X-rays are like a letter from the atomic world, and in the 20th century, we think that the world of the atomics and also atoms and molecules have taught us a great deal. And because of that, because this world of atoms and molecules produced these very interesting stories, Einstein was able to discover the theory of relativity. Well, people would scold me for saying these things, but I think once you find this essential theory, and well, in the world of physics, looking at the history of physics, it takes about 3 years for it to be advanced to a certain extent. For example, starting from the quantum theory to the theory in quantum dynamics to the theory of relativity, it took about 3 years. And which is more important? I think they're both equally difficult. Because yes, for example, there was a leapfrog to reach quantum dynamics, and so it had to reach the level where there was this indefinite level of the particle physics, elementary physics. And so in 1905, this was the year of miracle, we say. And and it took about until about 10 years for this to be applied. And to say that Einstein took as long as 11 years to come up with his theory, to say such a thing and criticize Einstein in some way is somewhat. People would say that only Maskawa, a clumsy person like him, who would be dared to say such things. But having said that,
Hmm. もう一つ言いますと、やっぱり一番最
But from the first discovery to the time when it becomes applicable to the daily lives, I said that it takes a century. But I have another story to tell. Well, about the superconductivity, the world of superconductivity. That was in 1911. The scientist Onnes wanted to experiment how low you could bring this temperature of a substance, and he needed metal to measure the temperature, and the resistance became 0 as a result of that. He wondered what had happened, and it was at that time. Well, it was in the world of micron. There were a number of discoveries were made, and quantum physics. Dynamics was born there, well, a bit later than that, but still. So anything could happen. So I have to end here, do I? I have 5 more minutes? Okay. So when we say superconductivity, it's people tended to think that there was a physical rule that was unknown. But in 1955, the BCS theory emerged, and so it came to be that people could explain this with the normal quantum dynamics. And then people thought it would be very attractive to have a 0 resistance, electric resistance. And so people wanted to apply this to different fields. There are many people who thought that way. And yet the superconductors, in order for them to become truly applicable in our daily lives, at least in Japan, in Yamanashi, there is this 10-kilometer rail, experimental rail, where they are using a superconductivity to run the maglev, doing the experiment with the maglev. And I think in 10 years' time, it will become applicable or be introduced. And this year marks 100th year since Onnes made this discovery, meaning that it takes about a century or so for these discoveries to become something usable. So simply put, it's like attitude, learning by doing and then discovering. And so that sort of approach is no longer applicable. You have to start from the basics. You have to study from the basics. And from there, you will be able to participate in science. And by doing so, in this long process, you might wonder how you can keep up your enthusiasm. I think friends are key. Your debate with your friends about science, this admiration for science. Well, at first you might be admired by an individual, a person, but through such experience, you would develop your admiration towards science and your hope towards science. I sincerely hope that this will happen, and I think that this will enable you to build up the energy so that you can develop state-of-the-art science. This will be your driving force. Please make friends and debate with your friends. And there might be some strange things coming up in this debate, but through such experience, young people will grow up. And you can develop energy through this process, energy to keep going. And I think you're in the process of making friends from different parts of the world. And I hope that you will foster this friendship, because the way ahead will be a thorny one, but your friendship will become your driving force. In 10 years' time, I hope that through your borderless friendship, you will be able to do such work, such good work. And on this note, I would like to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maskawa. Now I would like to give the microphone to Dr. Jun Nishimura, Associate Professor of Institute of Particle and Nuclear Studies of High Energy Accelerator Research Organization. Nishimura sensei, お願いします。
Thank you very much, Masukawa-san. Very nice and stimulating lecture. Now it's time for discussion and questions. Please raise your hand. Don't be shy.
煙に巻かれて
I think you are all perplexed too much to ask any questions, maybe.
About
これ難しいね
advice to young researchers or just any question. Yes, over there.
はい
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question. You said that as young researchers, we might be aspiring to do science. But I was wondering, in your case, when you were younger or even now, did you or do you still have a model, for example, an imaginary hero? You mentioned Don Quixote, or even someone, one of your friends or one of your parents or one of your professors that inspired you to do science?
Can I answer? Well, at the very beginning, it was my father. My father didn't go to university. He wasn't an educated man in that sense. However, he liked science, and he tried to convey his knowledge to me. He had nobody to talk to. He couldn't boast his knowledge. He could speak to his wife, but she wouldn't listen. He couldn't speak to his neighbors, so he decided to talk to me. And so, because of that, I became fond of science. Now, you might have thought strange. The lunar eclipse, why doesn't this happen every month? In the textbooks, you can only see a 2D model there. But the moon is spinning around Earth, meaning you might imagine that the lunar eclipse will occur every month. However, my father, he said that there is this angle of 5 degrees where this revolution of the Earth occurs, and how the moon spins around the Earth. And I haven't listened to my classroom teaching. However, when the teacher asks a strange question, I was able to answer that because of what my father told me. And I thought that I understood science very well. And what happened after that was that I call this the Sakata incident, actually. But Shoichi Sakata, Dr. Shoichi Sakata, announced a theory that became the very basics of the quark science. I think I read this in a magazine or something, and I was really impressed by this. And that's because the town where I lived in, it was not the capital of the prefecture. It was a local city, Nagoya, that is. But I thought that the most advanced science is being created here. And the textbooks until I used in high school only teaches us what happened up until the 19th century. And so young Maskawa thought that science was established and was completed, totally finished in the 19th century in Europe. But I found that something was happening in Nagoya now, and that inspired me. And I thought that I must go to Nagoya University and study under Professor Sakata. I wanted to meet Professor Sakata. I wanted to see where all these researches take place. But I couldn't speak English at all. So my friends and among 1,000 points, I only took about 800 points, where all my friends were getting 100%. But if you calculate Japanese history, world history, you have to learn so much and so much. And when you have these experiments, I was studying about 16 hours per day. So I studied and I slept and I ate in the lab. I think that's the time when I studied the most. Even after I became a researcher, I didn't study that much. So for me, it was Professor Sakata, the quark model of Gurman. How should I say this? He created the basics. He created the composite particle model. And that was what I admired most, and that's why I started on this path of science.
Yes.
I Jongmyeon came to Kampam, Korea, and the last year I listened to your lecture on this Korea, but I heard that is the use maybe the don't take as experiences go abroad the research or the science or corporate. You don't take as experience. I really so surprised to listen to yours mentioned like this. I want to ask a question to be graduates from Nagoya University in domestic area. All of the trend was effect with this USA the trend strongest tendency to be the greatest promise the domestic area. I wonder it is possible to study in domestic area. So what do you think of this in this point to compare with the USA and Europe and domestic areas? It is possible to what do you think of at this point?
はい、いいですか。特化している
Well, if I were to be asked if there was an advantage for me to just focusing on Japan domestically, no, I don't think there was any advantage to that. But Japan, since the Meiji period, we have been trying to introduce foreign culture into Japan. And therefore, if you read the textbooks in Japan, you could understand what is happening in the state-of-the-art science. But I think well, in our field, I think there's a lot of good information coming in. So I could do my research in Japan, elementary particle physics research in Japan, though you might wonder if it's sufficient. But yes, I was able to come up with relatively good results as a result of doing my work in Japan. But what is the advantage of going overseas? Well, it's not knowledge, really. As I said earlier, it's important that you debate with your peers. And I think that having such counterparts with which you can discuss things is important. And, well, in our research field, there is Dr. Yoichi Nambu. At the age of 35, he became professor at Osaka Ichi University. But he had this status, but he wanted to have the stimuli of debating with his peers. And seeking for this stimuli, he went to the United States. I think it's the character of the person. You can do research domestically to a certain extent, but if you want to have this stimulus, you could go overseas. But to the contrary, here in Japan, there are fewer and fewer Japanese students who want to study overseas because they think that they are middle class. They are satisfied with their current status. And they think that they can do research in Japan. And they don't have to go overseas. They become complacent. They feel safe here. But I think that going overseas and studying helps the person to build up the momentum to keep on striving to research harder. And I therefore think that it is not a negative to study overseas, but it's not a must for you to do research. You can do research even in Japan. That's my answer. Thank you.
I'm afraid we are running out of time, so yeah, each answer took a lot of time. But I hope you,
I'm very sorry.
Masukawa-san, personally during lunchtime, or yeah, he will be here until the end of the discussion time. So, let us thank Masukawa-san once again.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm a very talkative person. Once I start, I can't stop.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. Now we would like to move on to the next lecture. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ada E. Yonat, Nobel Prize Laureate in Chemistry in 2009, Director of the Helen and Milton A. Kimmelman Center for Biomolecular Structure Assembly, Weizmann Institute of Science. The title of the lecture is From Basic Science to Improved Liposomal Antibiotics. Dr. Yonat, if you please.